Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
All right, well, welcome. This is another episode of the Examine Life with Phil here, and this one's a continuation of last week's episode. It's the second part of my discussion with Philip Swenson on the simple foreknowledge solution to the problem of divine foreknowledge. If you haven't listened to the first part of the discussion from last week, I'd highly recommend you do that before diving into this week's, and we'll just dive right back into Philip and I's discussion. All right. Well, were there any other common objections or critiques that you would like to respond to that I'm not aware of? Because, as I said,
I think all the other objections would come from within other alternative perspectives. So maybe it would be good to go on and talk about. You were going to talk about the other. Because I think there are other objections, but they kind of arise from within Calvinism or from within open theism or something.
All right. Well, let's just dive right into what your opinion is on the other viewpoints then, and where you think they come up short, or what you like about them, if you do like anything about the other ones, because some people I've talked to have had very dim views of all the other viewpoints.
Right.
Okay. Well, the first one I'll ask your opinion on here is Molinism, which is becoming very, very popular these days. There's a very active Facebook group on Molinism that I'm a part of because they have some very good discussions in there. And that's actually the viewpoint Craig takes as well. And that claims that God uses middle knowledge, which is something you'd referenced earlier before, that is knowledge of what we will and will not do in certain situations, to arrange the world so that we will freely do what he wants or needs us to do. That is the example. Another example I like to use of this is, I know my wife well enough to know that at least that if all other things are equal, she's going to want me to make her a cup of coffee in the morning. And she knows the same thing about me because we know each other that well. But it doesn't really seem to be the case that knowledge in any sense causes us to have the cup of coffee. We just know each other that well. So since God knows us both exceptionally better than we know each other, then it would just seem to kind of intuitively follow that God would know us well enough to know what we're going to do in any given situation, even situations that we're not in or never will be in, like the example I gave earlier of me being the president of the U.S., which is almost certainly never going to happen. It can get far more technical and complicated than this, but that's what I found is at least the simple and probably best thrust of Molinism is there just seems to be something intuitively right about the idea that we can know each other well enough to make these predictions, so why can't God? Mm-hmm. And so there's the grounding objection to this, and some other people have said it only pushes the problem back a couple of steps. What do you have to say to that view?
Yeah, good. So I was a Molinist for a long time. I used to be in that Facebook group, I think, but I think you have to be a Molinist to be in it, so I had to leave once I stopped being a Molinist.
Well, I hope they don't listen to this then, because I want to stay in the group.
Yeah, you can lurk maybe and don't post your anti-Molinist stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the grounding objection, which just says, well, what could make these claims true? Like, what can make it true that you would be a nice guy if you were president or something? That one was never enough for me to stop being a Molinist, because I thought, look, Molinism is just so useful, gives God so much control that I will just accept weird brute facts if that's what I have to do to make it work, right? So that one was never enough. I will say I don't think Molinism is itself a solution. It's kind of like simple foreknowledge. It's not a solution to the problem of divine foreknowledge. It's sort of a theory that presupposes that there is a solution, but it doesn't itself explain why. There's no part of Molinism that says this is the reason the past isn't beyond our control or something like that. I think, but they Molinists must think that there is some solution. Okay, so here's why I'm not a Molinist anymore, even though I see how nice it is. So I think there's a dilemma for Molinists. Mm-hmm. So dilemma goes like this. either things beyond our control guarantee what we will do, or you have explanatory loops or explanatory circles. So suppose God makes you president because he sees what you would do if you were president, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now here's the question. Is it up to you what you would do if you were president? If it's not, then the fact that God made you president, plus the fact that that you would pass a certain policy if you were president, those two things together entail that you create that policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not up to you what you would do if you were president, then I think you're not free. There's things beyond control. The fact about what you would do, plus God's decision to put you in the situation that guarantee that you'll do that. And to me, that seems like you're not free anymore.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So that's one half the dilemma. If it's not up to you what you would do. But now suppose it is up to you what you would do if you were president, right? Well, then it looks like we have an explanatory loop. God makes you president because of what you would do. But then what you would do if you're president is true because of the choice you make when you're president. You get to decide what you would do. Well, then it looks like we have a loop, right? You're president because of what you would do, and you do what you do because you're president. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we definitely want to try and avoid explanatory loops. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Dilemma that got me off of Molinism.
Okay. Yeah. I actually the part that maybe it was actually a discussion that you might have been a part of at that conference 2 years ago, but it was actually a similar thing to that actually made me think, oh, well, maybe Molinism doesn't work quite as well as I thought. So you might have actually been responsible for pushing me back from that, because I myself considered myself a Molinist for a very long time, because it just seemed like the basic principle of it just seems intuitively right and seems to work. But that's what I was relating with. Well, all this does is seem to push the problem back a few steps, because it kind of could be the case, and I think this is what you were alluding to with half of your dilemma there, that God can kind of just like play the ultimate chess game and trap us, so to speak, where you sort of have a free choice, but you really don't. Like, I love playing strategy games where it can be the case, and even some of these very, very complicated ones where, yeah, you're making moves, but you come to a point where you really only have one move. There's really only one thing you can do. And so do you really have a choice? Well, sort of, but not in the sense of what we really want to say when you have it. Not in the sense of what we really want to say, yes, I have a choice. I mean, maybe that example breaks down because I could say, forget this game and turn it off, and I can't really do that with life.
Yeah, because even doing nothing is a choice.
Is a choice, yeah. Okay.
So the principle that I like is, if things beyond my control guarantee my action, then it's not really a free action or a free choice. And that, I think, is what Molinism runs into there. The fact that I would do it plus God's decision, hey, that's the end of the game. You're going to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And what does seem to me, this will relate to the next viewpoint, Calvinist, a little bit, where when I was talking to the guy who presented that view, he said, well, but isn't it the case that there certainly, at least I hope this is what he said, I don't want to misrepresent him, but isn't it the case that there are certainly times where that is the case, where there are circumstances beyond your control that guarantee you're going to do things? And that just, yeah, absolutely. But it also seems to me that that's definitely not the case all the time, where there are examples where, yeah, I don't really seem to have a choice, but there are other cases where I do.
Yeah.
Which, hey, maybe that almost ties into your theory about moral morality that you talked about at the beginning, where people who are more moral, we don't give them as much praise because in a certain sense, they've limited themselves by being more moral, by building more character, where they're not as free to do wrong things anymore. And the same thing for people who've made bad choices.
Yeah, that's exactly how I think about it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, did you have anything more to say about Molinism then, or?
Let's see. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about Molinism.
Okay. Yeah, I'll say that I really do still like that viewpoint, and part of me kind of just wants it to be right. Because the simple thrust of it just seems so right. But I'm still sympathetic. But
too beautiful to be wrong. It just that's so much awesome stuff, so elegantly.
Yeah,
that's why I hung on to it for as long as I did.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about the Calvinist or the Reformed view then, which it more or less just accepts the argument for theological fatalism and then argues that we're not free in the usual sense of free. That is, typically what they'll do, and the guy I had on to talk about this, Tim Carter, this is exactly what he said. Yeah, this is the way I do it. He says, it defines free will as simply being able to do what you want to do, as opposed to being able to do something or not do something. But I think that this definition has the problem of being just absolutely synonymous with determinism. In this sense, it seems to kind of define its way to victory or circular, as it's starting with the definition it assumes, as it's starting with that definition and then assumes a type of determinism from the start. And then further to me, it does seem very, very counterintuitive to deny the idea that we have the free will in the sense of being able to choose to do something or not do something. So what do you have to say to that viewpoint?
So I don't think we should think of them as, at least the time, so maybe some Calvinists would just say we don't have free will, but others would say we do have free will. Free will just means being able to do what you want to do. And then they would say, look, you do have a choice between two different things. What it means to say you could have done that other thing is if you had wanted to do it, you could have done it, right? So that's called the conditional analysis of free will. And I don't have a problem with starting with that and trying to make it work. I just think it runs into problems. So the example that's commonly given is compulsions or phobias, right? So take a kleptomaniac who their desire to steal sort of intuitively overrides their will and they steal. A lot of people wouldn't want to say that they freely stole or that they could have done otherwise. Or take someone who has say you saw someone, or say your daughter's graduating from high school. It seems like that you should go to the graduation. But suppose you have just this incredibly strong phobia of leaving the house, such that intuitively you would say your desire to not leave the house is so strong that you really couldn't have left the house. Then I would want to say, yeah, you're not really, even though you did what you wanted to do, you followed your desire. You weren't really free to go to the graduation. So I think the problem with that desire-based view is they have trouble making sense of the difference between people who are free and people who are under compulsion or are not free because of a phobia that they have. Because both are acting on their desire. Just in the one case, the desire seems so strong that you're not free.
Yeah. It seems to me just kind of, I don't know, obvious and apparent that people almost always do what they desire. There's other times where they will say, well, I didn't want to do this, but I felt like I had no choice. But you can kind of explain that away by saying, no, that really is what you wanted to do. Even you're kind of like doing a post hoc rationalization or something.
You wanted to save your life or something.
Yeah. But the primary problem I've had with this is that it seems to me this Reformed or Calvinistic understanding just entails that God made people knowing that they would necessarily be damned and away from him for all eternity. He made people knowing that and not only knowing, in the sense of having knowledge, but determining, in fact, that they were going to sin and be away from him and things along those lines. And then he turns around and punishes them for it, which strikes me as quite unjust. And since it seems to me the Christian God is certainly not unjust, then I have to turn around and say, well, there must be something wrong with that viewpoint.
Yeah, so yeah, that might just be like the most extreme version of the problem of evil. If it was totally under God's control, whether someone goes to heaven or hell, and he just puts them in hell, that's like, geez, why on earth would he do that?
Yeah.
So I feel that objection very strongly. One thing they could do there is appeal to what's called skeptical theism. And God has reasons that are just totally beyond our.
Yeah.
But I do think that since that seems so bad, you have to put a whole lot of weight then on. It's just mystery or something like that. Yeah,
and that's another topic that I find fascinating. I read a little bit about that, and I actually managed to go to a conference presentation or two on skeptical theism one time, and that's a very fascinating topic, where the idea generally, as I understand it, is you can always say that any God worth being called God might have reasons that we can't understand because he's so infinitesimally greater than we are. And there's something intuitively quite right about that, it seems to me. But the trouble I've always had with that, and this might be going on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's interesting, is, well, there just kind of has to be a terminator somewhere where you need to be able to say, yeah, but come on, God's not going to do that. Because without some way of saying, no, there's no good that could come from this particular evil, then you have to say, well, no matter what happens, God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to behold.
Right.
That obviously seems wrong to me, where you have to turn around and be able to say at some point, no, that's evil and this is good. Otherwise, all of our moral judgments are kind of useless.
Right. Yeah, you want to be able to say, like, if all we ever saw was just unending horror and unending suffering, that would be evidence against God. And then,
at least that, yeah.
Right. And then the Calvinist thing doesn't look that much better. People going to hell forever because of God's choice. Another move the Calvinists could make there is just be universalists and say God determines everyone to go to heaven. But then they'd have to fight that theological battle.
Yeah, although you can tell me if you think I'm right about this, just from my practical experience of talking with people. I don't think I've met a Calvinist who's a universalist. Have you?
Oh, yeah. Maybe different personality types there or something. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, the ones I've known would probably either label that view as heresy or come close to doing it. Right. So, okay.
They might not want. It's a move they could make, but they might not want to. Perhaps.
Yeah, for other reasons. Yeah. I've found that with them, they tend to take a very, very, very strong view of divine providence, where they think that everything that happens has to be divinely ordained by God. Therefore, it has to be divinely ordained by God that this person sinned, and then they just kind of bite the bullet on that, so to speak. It seems to me. Okay. All right, well, let's move on and talk about divine timelessness then. And this view responds by arguing that the tension only exists within time, and thus, if God's removed from time, then there's no problem. However, I'll add this caveat here that I was talking about this with a friend of mine who's attended the same school as mine, Jonathan Studi, who's a Thomist philosopher, and he's told me that the timeless part of it is really unimportant to the Thomistic response to this, where he says what really solves the problem is making a distinction between different types of causes. That is, he says, God is the providential cause of all things in the same sense that my mind is the cause of my leg moving, and hence the timeless part is actually irrelevant, and the real answer is making a distinction between different types of causes. He actually said, calling this divine timelessness, it happens all the time, but it should be a misnomer. It's a bad way to label the viewpoint. So.
Yeah, good. So it seems like there's really just two different views. One view is God's timeless, and that avoids the problem. Another view is the way in which God causes our actions is such that it doesn't interfere with free will. And those are really just two different views. On the two types of causes move, On my view, if anything beyond your control guarantees what you will do, then you're not free. So why I'd be skeptical of the different types of causes move is I just don't care what type of cause or explanation it is.
Mm-hmm.
If it's beyond my control and it guarantees what I'm going to do, then I feel stuck. So that I'd be skeptical of that sort of move.
My leg isn't free to tell me no, at least not typically. Yeah.
Right, exactly. On the timelessness view, I do think it helps some, at least seems to help initially, because, as I said, the past seems beyond our control. Well, if you say God's not in the past, he's in this timeless realm. Well, I don't have any intuition about whether the timeless realm is beyond my control or not. Maybe I can affect the timeless realm, whereas I had that intuition that I couldn't affect the past, right? So I do think it initially helps when you think about it that way. But I think there's a way to recreate the problem on the timelessness view if you think that God interacts with the world. And so say you think that God can give prophecies about what will happen in the future. So God in the timeless realm says, I want people to know what Phil's going to do tomorrow. So then he carves on a stone yesterday what you're going to do tomorrow. Now you have something in the past that looks like it guarantees what you're going to do. So if you think God can interact in the past on the basis of his timeless knowledge, then I think the problem will come back. And so I think the only way to make the timelessness thing work all by itself is to say God can't really use his knowledge to affect the past.
Oh, you have to remove the causal element from it. Okay.
And then that would be pretty disappointing. Then it would be like what Greg Boyd was saying, that, he sees it, but he can't do anything with it. Because we
probably don't want to go that route. Yeah.
Exactly. If he does something with it, like he tells a prophet what you're going to do, well, now you have to be able to affect the past again, because the prophet needed to not be told that by God if you're going to do something else. Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Okay. Well, that's let's see. Yeah, and in fact, that's pretty much the exact objection I was going to give to that viewpoint. So I think we can just move on there, unless you have something else to say about divine timelessness.
We agree it doesn't work, I guess. Then.
Yeah. It's one of those viewpoints where I guess when I was a little kid and hadn't really thought these out, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but it doesn't kind of work on closer reflection. At least it doesn't seem to me it does. And if my friend Jonathan is listening to this, I'm sure he's going to be railing and demand to come on and respond. And hey, that'll be great. More content for the show. So, okay. So let's move on to the open theist view. And this, I know open theism is kind of a catch-all term for many different views. That's something Alan Rhoda and I discussed when I had him on to talk about it. But loosely speaking, I think we can say that it solves the problem by saying that God really does not know all of the future, because at least some of the future are things that can't be known. And the best way I've heard this explained is it's sort of like things like a square circle are impossible because it just can't exist. And so it doesn't quite work exactly like this, but most open theists that I'm aware of will then say, well, knowledge of at least some parts of the future is a little bit like the square circle. You just can't have it. And therefore, God doesn't have it, even though he is omniscient. He knows everything that there is to know, but some parts of the future are things that just can't be known, so he doesn't know them. They're not part of reality. Maybe you could... I know William Lane Craig rejects the open theistic view, but he doesn't think the future exists either, so you could maybe make a little bit of a connection there. So,
right, exactly.
So what do you have to say about that viewpoint?
Yeah, good. So they can... they can motivate the view by saying, look, the future, the reason God can't see it is the future just isn't there to be seen, So I think, initially you get a problem there with knowledge about the past. Well, look, if he can't know the future because the future isn't there, well, how can he know the past? If your present is and the past isn't there either. So That's one possible worry there. But so the main reason I'm not an open theist is just because of my view about time. I think the future does exist, and so I think it's there, and once it's there, why couldn't he know it? So that's one reason. There's this problem for open theism called the prediction problem. So if they say, look, there's no fact about who will win the NBA Finals next year yet. There's just no truth to be known yet about that. Well, it seems like we make predictions and then we say, so suppose I say the Clippers are going to win the NBA championship next year. Then if it comes next year and that happens, I'll say I was right. But if the standard sort of open theist is correct, then I wasn't right because that wasn't true when I said it, because there was no facts yet about. So
interesting.
So I actually think that's kind of a tricky problem for them to make sense of our predictions, our behavior involving predictions too.
Okay. Yeah. And I've found that, at least intuitively, it seems to me part of the problem with this is that it does seem, as you were just saying there, that I know the future in some senses, at least, and not even in the sense of like I make a prediction about who's going to win the NBA Finals next year, and I either just so happen to be right, or maybe I'm really, really into NBA stats and statistics and stuff, so I can at least make an educated guess. But I think I know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow.
Yeah.
So why can't God know that? And, and I think I know a few various other things that probably are a little less certain, but other people would have a harder time knowing, like the example I give of my wife and I having coffee. I'm pretty sure I know that all other things being equal, I'm going to have a cup of coffee tomorrow morning because that's what I always do. And same thing with my wife. So why not God? And I know when I put this objection to Alan, he said, well, I think God knows everything about the future that you do and just more because he's cleverer. So I thought that was a very good response. And the other objection I find to this is the idea that there's some parts of the future that God doesn't know just seems kind of, especially if you're a Christian theist, there seems to be something intuitively wrong with that, as the God you see in Scripture is constantly making predictions about what's going to happen in prophecies and giving, as you were citing earlier about the example of somebody writing down on a stone what's going to happen tomorrow. Well, what I was going to do tomorrow. Well, God literally does that all over in Scripture. So how do you make sense of that?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, good. So on the point about parts of the future. So open theists can say, well, some parts are determined. Like it could be determined that the sun will rise tomorrow. So you and God both know that. And then they'll have to say, if you're predicting like something that a free person will do, like if you predict that, I won't jump up and wave my arms in the next 30 seconds, they'll say, you don't really know that for sure. You just know that it's extremely likely. So that's what they have to try to say. You just know it's very, very likely to happen. I'll mention there's kind of two types of open theism. So one type is what we've been talking about, where they say there is no truth yet about the future. But another type might be what's called limited foreknowledge open theism. So they say there is a truth, but God sort of refrains from knowing it, because if he knew it, then you wouldn't be free anymore.
So it's like the example of him closing his eyes.
What's that?
Oh, so it's like God is closing his eyes while he's doing things just to avoid that problem.
He wants you to be free, right? So that on that view, you could know things God didn't, because you're knowing it, since you're not infallible. You're knowing it doesn't threaten their freedom, so you could know something that he doesn't know because he has to be careful. But that's kind of a strange view, I think.
Yeah, okay. And, all right.
On your point about God making
go ahead,
in Scripture, I think the best thing for the open theist to say there is he's just gonna commit to, if necessary, overriding free will to make it happen. So, like, if he says this is going to happen in 100 years, then he hopes it happens as a result of free will, but if necessary, he's going to make it happen.
Yeah. As I recall, when I put that objection to Alan, he said, well, it's sort of like it's just that God has so much power that he can make it happen over and above your free will in the sense that you're talking about. And the analogy that I thought of is think of one of the Roman emperors back in like the early, 200 or 300 AD. He could say to some of the barbarian leaders, I'm going to come destroy you. And then he could make it happen because he had that power, not because he knew the future.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, so do you have any other reasons any other problems with open theism other than that your view of time kind of commits you to rejecting it?
Not really. So mainly just that, and then I think it's an advantage of my view that I avoid like the prediction problem and the problem you raised about. It seems like you can know, what your wife's going to do tomorrow or something like that too.
Okay. Well, let's see. The last thing I have here is, I know you read over the notes, that I have my own kind of idea that I've been toying with, and I wanted to ask for your opinion on that. But after we've been going through this, I'm almost inclined to say it seems, if I'm remembering what I wrote right, it seems very similar to your viewpoint, where my idea was, well, hey, if you just define what it means to know a little bit, and then you define all these other things a little bit, then the problem kind of seems to go away. So what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, maybe you could say a little bit more about your solution. So my understanding, your thought is, look, there's no reason God's knowing it has to mean he's the cause. Maybe say a little bit more about your solution so I can get it clear in my head.
Okay, yeah. And I'm not like committed to this. It's kind of an idea I wrote for an essay, and I'm like, oh, well, maybe there's something to hear, or maybe people who've studied this more in depth are going to read this and go, no, you're making a very grave mistake. So, but yeah, my idea is that the fact that I have knowledge doesn't seem to intuitively connect to causation of at least in and of itself. You can have knowledge of things without there being causation. Now, knowledge can like cause my beliefs and things along those lines, but in the sense of actual physical events that happen in the real world, it doesn't seem to me like there's necessarily a connection between knowledge that you or I have and those events.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't seem to me, at least when I think about how my knowledge of other people relates to what they will and won't do, that there's any real connection or causation there. I'll go back to this example because it just seems to work so well, that I know, and I think about it as pretty decent a sense as you can say no, that all other things being equal, my wife's going to have a cup of coffee tomorrow and I will too. Now, but at the same time, if you just stop and think about that, that knowledge doesn't cause that to happen. And in fact, in a similar sense to what you were saying, it almost seems like it's the other way around. The fact of it is what's causing my knowledge. And so what I'm kind of saying there is, well, just define what it means for people to make a free action, to have free will. They can choose X or not choose X. And then just think about a little bit and define a little bit what knowledge of these things mean. And I know that can get a little controversial into various areas of epistemology, but I don't think you even have to like get really deep into it. Just think intuitively what it means. And you see that there's no real causal connection there, at least not a necessary one. And so then I want to say, well, if that's the case with the knowledge we as human people have and free will, why is it necessarily different for God? And so then the move I want to make there is to say, well, you really kind of have two options. You can say the way God knows things is similar to the way we do, in which case I would want to say, see, no problem. Or if you want to say, but something about the way God knows things is radically different than the way we think about it, which I'd be very sympathetic to because he's God and I'm not. But then you have to say, well, but where's the problem? If you don't know how God knows things, if you can't define it, then how do you even know there's a problem there to begin with?
Yeah, good. So one reason to think God's knowledge might be trickier is if you say, I know my wife's going to have a cup of coffee tomorrow. Well, there's no problem with her just making it the case that you were wrong, right? She could decide not to have coffee, and then you were just wrong. So she doesn't have to change the past or anything, right? You were just wrong. But God can't be wrong. So you believe she's going to have coffee, no problem. Your belief turns out to be wrong. He believes she's going to have coffee. Well, then she's going to have coffee, right? So that's one reason to think God's knowledge is more potentially threatening. But I think you brought up a really good point that it's not, incredibly obvious that just because God knows something, that there has to be a causal connection between him knowing it. So some philosophers have said the mere knowledge isn't a threat to your freedom, but knowledge is a sign that something's a threat to your freedom. Because how could God know it? Maybe another way to think about it is, why is there this invariable connection between what God believes and what you do? Why does he always have the right belief about what you do? You might think either it's because something's guaranteeing what you do, right? So one reason God might know is because it's guaranteed that you'll do that. And if that's the reason, then it looks like you're not free, right?
Yeah.
He knows it is because it's guaranteed. But if that's not why, well, then how could he know it? And you might think, well, then it has to be because your belief, your action explains his belief. And then you'd converge on the same solution that I've given, where your action explains his belief. A third view would just be it's just sort of like this logical coincidence. Like it just they line up, but there's no explanation. And then your view might be a different solution than mine, because you're saying, if there's no explanation either way, his knowledge doesn't explain your belief, or his knowledge doesn't explain your choice, or guarantee that there is an explanation of your choice, and your choice doesn't explain his knowledge, it's just a coincidence. Then you might say, well, then you're still free, I guess, there.
Well, I don't want to say it's just a coincidence. That seems almost lazy to me.
Yeah. So if you think it's not just a coincidence, then you might think, well, the explanation better go from your choice to his knowledge instead of the other way around or something. And then we would be on the same page, I think.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I don't think I'd really quite grappled with the wrinkle you threw into it well, but maybe I could be wrong about my wife, but God can't be.
Right.
I guess I'm going to have to think about that a bit more, because I guess you could, in the way I set it up, I was kind of saying, I was just not assuming, I was asserting that I am right when I know that.
Right.
But that might not be the case.
Turns out you are right, because she drank the coffee. But we don't think it's like impossible for her to do something that would have made you wrong. Because you're not essentially omniscient.
Yeah. Okay.
But we do think it's impossible for her to do something to make God wrong. So she doesn't have to change. So to not drink the coffee, she doesn't have to change the past in the sense of changing what you believe, right? She just makes the case that your belief is false. And that's not changing the past in any serious way. Whereas she has to change what God believed back in the day, which seems like a more serious change of the past.
Oh yeah, it's a far more serious problem for God to be wrong than me to be wrong.
Yeah.
So, okay, interesting. All right, yeah, I'll have to think about that a bit more. And as I said, I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh yeah, this is the way to go. I just thought, oh well, maybe there's something here. I should. I'm doing this podcast series on it anyway. So
insofar as I understood it, I think you're on the right track, or the way I like to think about it anyway. So
okay, cool. All right. Well, that's pretty much the extent of the notes I'd prepared for our discussion. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about this issue or some related topics? Or
Let's see. I'll just mention, I think you had a question in the notes, like, are there any other viewpoints I'm aware of that are worth discussing on the...
Oh, yeah, I think I might have accidentally skipped over that one. I did say something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So a view that's kind of similar to mine, but I think a bit different, is called Ockhamism.
Mm-hmm.
So Ockhamism could be used by a simple foreknowledge person or by a Molinist or someone like that. So Ockhamism says there's two types of facts about the past, hard facts and soft facts. And the hard facts are fixed, but not all of the soft facts are fixed. So a hard fact is something like Kennedy was shot, right? That's just about the past. A soft fact about the past is Kennedy was shot 56 years before we had this conversation. That fact is kind of about the past, but kind of about the present, right? Because it's partly about Kennedy, partly about our conversation. So they say the solution is the solution is that God's beliefs are really just soft facts because they're kind of about the future, by being about what you're going to do in the future. So they don't have to be held fixed. So that, I think, is a little bit different than mine because I don't care about hard versus soft. I just care about dependence. Does the past depend on the future? Whereas they care about, they sometimes call them temporally relational facts, facts that are really partly about the future. Those are not truly about the past, so they don't need to be held fixed. So that's one other approach to be aware of. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And I don't recall the details off the top of my head, but I do recall reading an essay or two one time that actually questioned whether you could make that distinction between hard and soft facts and tried to say that that's kind of a false distinction. But I can't recall enough of the details off the top of my head as to how they were attacking.
It's very controversial whether you can do it in a way that gets the results that they want, where God's beliefs count as soft. So that's why I like my approach is I can kind of skip over that whole argument about how to define hard and soft facts. Yeah,
you're trying to avoid all these problems and just say, find something that works and isn't doesn't have to be so controversial, other than the time travel thing, at least.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, did you have any? If you have anything else you want to add, or any resources you want to point people toward where they could learn some more about it? Because, as I said, I did some research into this, and I've got a couple of books where a few people wrote, like David Hunt wrote an essay or two about simple foreknowledge, but it does seem to be a viewpoint that it's actually kind of hard to find some good resources on. If you Google it, you get a few people giving vague criticisms of it and not really an explanation of the viewpoint. Yeah. So
I think Hunt is definitely the person to read for how to see the simple foreknowledge view worked out. So he has a chapter it's called 4 Views on Foreknowledge book. It's 4 Views on, which I think would be a good place for people to start. But he also has several good papers. He's worked out in detail like how providential control could work on simple foreknowledge, and I think he's done really awesome stuff on that. Dean Zimmerman also has a really good paper on providence and simple foreknowledge, but his is extremely technical, so it'll depend on how technical your listeners want to go, whether they should look at that. On the solution I defended, based on the past depending on the future. So there's philosopher Trenton Merricks has written 2 good papers on this. So one's called Truth and Freedom, and another one's called Foreknowledge and Freedom. And those are both good if you want to think more about the solution to the foreknowledge problem I was defending. And then I'll also plug my paper, which is called Foreknowledge and Explanatory Dependence, where I also try to defend that solution. So those are some resources to look at.
Okay. Where could people find your paper? Do you have like a website they could go to or anything like that?
They Google me, they would find it, yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, do you got anything else you want to plug or mention?
That's it.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed this discussion, and especially because you're the last of the 5 major viewpoints, so I can kind of wrap all this up now, and I'll be able to do a wrap-up episode where I talk about what I thought about all of it, because I've learned quite a bit as I went through it. So cool.
Nice. I'll have to listen to that.
Yeah.
Sounds like you can now make an educated, form an educated viewpoint.
Well, that's part of the idea. Yeah. When I started it, part of my thinking was when you look for one of the more common objections you hear against Christianity and Christian theism is that you hear variants of the problem of divine foreknowledge as a common objection all the time. But what I wanted to say is, well, that's not really a very good objection, because here's 5 viewpoints you can take, any one of which is, if they're true, they just solve the problem. Like, I don't think Calvinism is true, but I'll flat out admit to you, if it is, there's no problem of divine foreknowledge.
Right.
And I think it's the same with every single one of these viewpoints you can take. And that tells me, well, this isn't a good objection, because here's 5 possible responses that show there's no core contradiction. And as soon as you know about how the logic of contradiction works, you'd have to show that every one of those was impossible to show there's a real contradiction. And I don't think anybody's done that. In fact, I think it'd be a very difficult thing to do. You're going to show that Calvinism doesn't work, Molinism doesn't work, open theism doesn't work, simple foreknowledge doesn't work, and divine timelessness doesn't work. Good luck.
Right. Yeah. That's a hard battle, especially since lots of people have done a great job defending all of them. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I mean, you can tell me what you think about this, but for the most part, the people who I talk to would then agree and say, yeah, that is the case, where if any one of these works, the problem goes away. And most of them then even said, and I only take, like, say, the Molinist position because that's the one that seems most plausible to me, but it wouldn't bother me a great deal if it turned out that open theism was true or something like that. So,
yeah, that's right. I think Calvinism is one that would bother me a little bit more, but a lot of the other ones, those turn out to be true. But, yeah.
I'm kind of with you on that one. That one I have some problems with that go beyond the philosophical, but it still is an option. So okay,
right.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and stop the recording, and we can wrap this up here then.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. And if you ever just have something you want to talk about or come on the podcast for, I'm always happy to have guests on. It's far more interesting to talk to people than for me to make notes and lecture for an hour. And so you'd be certainly welcome. Awesome. And if nothing else, I hope I run into you again at another conference, because now we'll have more things to talk about. Okay, so that's the extent of Philip and I's discussion, and with him giving us the simple foreknowledge viewpoint on the problem of divine foreknowledge, that's all of the 5 major viewpoints you can have on the problem of divine foreknowledge. We've had them all. Done Calvinism, Molinism, open theism, the Thomistic perspective, and simple foreknowledge. So quite a handful. So now the next episode I'll do on the problem of divine foreknowledge is I'll go back through all of those interviews I had with people, and I'll try and take the major points and summarize them and do kind of a wrap-up episode. And that'll probably happen next week unless I get a guest or something exciting comes up or something like that. But yeah, so that's like 10 hours of content, and I'm going to go through it all and summarize and wrap it up for you. So if you don't want to go back and listen to all 10 hours, just listen for my wrap-up, and that'll make it a lot easier. Now, before I end the podcast this week, I wanted to go ahead and do another quick segment. This will be kind of an update / facepalm and sigh award of the week segment, because it's kind of an update to some stuff I touched on before, as well as a facepalm and sigh award. So you might recall about 3 weeks ago on episode 33, How Christians Should Engage with Culture, I gave kind of a soft facepalm and sigh award to the conservative commentator Ben Shapiro for his critique of an article where somebody was criticizing evangelical purity culture from the 90s. Go back and listen to that if you want to get all the details. I tried to go pretty in-depth because you had to go kind of in-depth to point out the error that was going on there. Well, in that episode, I referenced a guy named Joshua Harris who wrote a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which was kind of the zeitgeist of that movement. And last week, he announced that he and his wife are getting separated. Some of the news stories I looked at said his wife's now going by her maiden name on social media, and both of them I guess they announced it over Instagram and had a picture where both of them said we're separating, and I guess from the things they said, it seems to be a somewhat amicable split, but still, they've got 3 kids together and have been married for, I don't recall, I think something like 13 or 14 years. So, anyhow, naturally, because Harris wrote a book saying, hey, this is how to do courtship and have a good, healthy, he wouldn't say dating because that book was against dating, but in any sense, something like dating relationship that will lead you to a good, healthy marriage, a lot of people are then jumping on the bandwagon and saying, hey, wait a minute. This kind of proves his ideas are wrong. So, in a certain sense, it's kind of an update to the previous one I did because it's more news about this evangelical purity culture movement from the 90s. But in another sense, it's a facepalm and sigh award because I'm going to go after some bad reasoning that's going on here. Now, I first saw this on Facebook. That's where most people see things nowadays. Some people were sharing posts about this and things along those lines. If you aren't in circles where on social media where people talk about evangelical or ex-evangelicals and things along those lines, you might not have seen this because it's, a couple splitting up is most of the time not really worthy of being a national news story. And the only reason this is something people are considering any kind of a news story is because Harris wrote that book. So the first post I saw about this was written by a guy named Kyle Barrington, who I don't personally know. And he goes through and talks about how Harris wrote that book and some of the principles Harris tried to lay down in that book. And the key point in his post, he says, last year, 2018, Harris confessed that the material in his book had done more damage than good. And just this week, Harris's life proved it. He is getting a separation from his wife, whom he married based on the following principles he wrote in his book. And I won't go into those principles. You can look those up if you want, and I talked about them in that other episode anyway. Similarly, a woman named Libby Ann, who writes a blog at pathos.com, says of this, like many others, I wish the best in life to Harris and his wife, who is now going by her maiden name, Shannon Bond. But I'm going to take a moment to be a pessimist here. I don't think this separation will change anything in a Christian homeschooling world that is still militantly preaching virginity until marriage. Those intent on pushing purity will find something to explain away Harris's split and then go right on teaching the same exact thing. Another woman who writes a blog at Pathos, Suzanne Tickemeyer, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing her last name, as everybody who listens to this knows I'm just terrible with names. Anyhow, she wrote an article about this too, and says, now Harris and his wife have announced they are separating and planning on divorcing. I feel horribly sad for them, but not surprised. Toxic purity culture takes 2 more victims. And finally, I'll reference one last blog here, which was written by Sarah Beth Kaplan. And again, this one's on Pathos. I guess people who are anti-Harris and this purity culture movement write a lot on Pathos. Anyhow, she wrote a whole article about it, and the key point I'm looking at here, she says, tempting though it may be to gloat about the news, keep in mind that Harris was indoctrinated too. Well, he is fully responsible for perpetuating toxic ideologies as an adult. He grew up in the same toxic purity culture that he encouraged with his readers. He likely didn't know any better when he inadvertently became the father of a movement. The news of his separation essentially confirms what we already knew. Purity culture makes extraordinary promises that it ultimately cannot keep. So now I ask you, what's the fallacy going on here? What's the problem with reasoning? If you think about it for a moment, you might be able to see it. But I won't keep you in suspense. I'll just come right out and tell you. It's the fallacy of hasty generalization. Every one of these authors who I just cited and quoted to you, they're all assuming that somehow the principles that Harris espoused in that book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and the principles of the evangelical purity culture movement from the 90s, that those are what is responsible for Harris now separating from his wife. And they don't know that, and neither do I. It could be any number of other things. That is, maybe one or both of them had an affair. And I'm not saying they did. I don't know. I don't know, and you don't know. My only point is, it could be there's a whole host of other reasons why they are separating that have absolutely nothing to do with what happened in the purity culture in the book he wrote. Now, in this particular case, it's very easy to see why people are making this hasty generalization because, hey, there is something really odd about a guy who wrote a book saying, hey, this is the way to have a good pre-marriage relationship that'll lead you into a good marriage relationship, who then ends up separated from his wife. That should lead you to suspect, maybe there's something wrong with the principles he's espousing here. You can kind of see how that's a somewhat reasonable conclusion to draw. At least it seems that way. But the trouble is, hasty generalization applies in both what I'm going to call easy and hard examples. It's very easy to see in some circumstances that somebody drew a bad or a hasty generalization where they're assuming causes are connected that aren't. Let's say, for example, you've got a friend who is running a business and he has no clue about economics, about supply and demand, about income versus expenses and things like that. So you're pretty well convinced his business is going to fail because he just has absolutely no idea what he's doing. Well, that's fairly reasonable. And then a couple months later, his business fails. And so you might think, yeah, of course it failed. The guy had no idea what he was doing, so of course it failed. Well, suppose you do a little more research and you find out the reason it failed was because the local government passed a bunch of regulations that forced businesses like his out of business. Well, if that was the reason why, it had nothing to do with his failure to understand economics and how businesses work. Or suppose you find out that, just randomly due to an accident, there was a fire that burned the business he had down to the ground where there was nothing left there. Well, again, his business failed, but it had nothing to do with the bad principles he believed in. So that's a hasty generalization you made there. Now, I also feel like I should add here that hasty generalization is what's termed an informal fallacy, and that's versus a formal fallacy. Now, a formal fallacy is when something is flat wrong all the time. It's like if somebody says 2 + 2 = 5. That's just flat wrong. There's no way or circumstance or context in which that will ever be right. However, informal fallacies are fallacies where it's wrong kind of depending on the context of what's going on. You could loosely think of it like this. An informal fallacy, sometimes that reasoning you're using might be right, sometimes it might be wrong, but because it might be wrong, you shouldn't reason that way. So, appeal to authority is a great example of this. Appeal to authority is often cited in debates about philosophy and philosophy of religion and theology as a fallacy where if you reference this person who said this, they'll say, someone might respond with, that's just an appeal to authority, you need to give me the actual argument. Well, appeal to authority isn't always a fallacy, it isn't always wrong. Authorities aren't always wrong, especially when you appeal to the right authority. If we were discussing something like theoretical physics, and I decided I wanted to appeal to a theoretical physicist and I could explain all his theories, well, that's an appeal to authority, but it's not an improper appeal to authority. So that's why appeal to authority is an informal fallacy, because sometimes it is bad. Like, for example, if I appealed to, say, a biologist for my positions on philosophy of religion, because that's not what a biologist is trained in. However, if I were to then turn around and appeal to that biologist for, say, information about, like, genetics or animal classification or something like that, well, that would be perfectly fine, because a biologist is an good authority on those things. And so that's why appeal to authority is an informal fallacy, because sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong, and that's different from a formal fallacy where it's always wrong. So hasty generalization is an informal fallacy because sometimes you'll make the hasty generalization and it'll turn out you were right. But sometimes you make the hasty generalization and it'll turn out you were wrong. So in the business example, sometimes that happens and maybe you're right that the problem was your friend knew nothing about business. And then in some other circumstances, it might turn out that the business failed and that had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he knows nothing about what he's doing and should never have been running a business. Sometimes circumstances are beyond people's control. So, if you just assume from the get-go, yeah, it failed because of his bad ideas on economics, because he has no idea what he was doing, that's a hasty generalization. You were wrong because you didn't have all the information and you just assumed, yeah, his ignorance caused his business to fail when it was these other things. Now, as I said, that's an easy example to see. It's much, much harder to see how this is an error in the case of Harris because he espoused these principles that he claimed would lead you to a good marriage, and then apparently his marriage has failed. At least that's the way it looks anyhow. But because it's perfectly possible that marriage could fail and people could get separated for all kinds of other reasons that have nothing to do with the book he wrote when he was a kid and influences from the evangelical purity culture movement, then without that further information, you're making a hasty generalization when you say, oh yeah, he wrote that book and now his marriage is a failure, therefore that book is wrong. No. You have to go back and look at the actual principles and ideas that book espoused and then evaluate them as is. I'm not, and none of these other authors were in a position to know that, yeah, Harris's marriage, they're getting separated because of those principles he espoused. Harris and his wife, and maybe their family, they might be, because they probably know all the reasons why, but we're not. And for obvious reasons, they're not going to tell us all that. It's not our business. Now, back when I talked about this a couple weeks ago in episode 33, I also talked about where I thought that purity culture movement kind of went wrong and critiqued some of the principles there. But you see, what I did is I critiqued the principles and said, here's why it didn't work here, here's why it might have worked here, and so on and so forth. I didn't turn around and say, hey, people's marriages didn't work when they followed this principle, therefore the principle is wrong. The real world is often far more difficult and complicated than that type of reasoning allows for. And that's why this fallacy of hasty generalization exists. And it's not that it's always bad to make generalizations. You often have to. Loosely speaking, generalizations are kind of a type of inductive reasoning, which is a perfectly valid type of reasoning. I've talked about it before. The problem comes when you don't have all or enough of the information, and then you generalize anyway, and that's why it's a hasty generalization. One of the classic examples that's often used in like logic textbooks is, you've always seen white swans everywhere you go, so you'll make a hasty generalization that all swans are white. Well, you'd be wrong. There's black swans too. And that's what's going on with Harris and his wife separating here. Some of the people who wrote these articles or blog posts were respectful about it, noting that it's a tragic thing, and other people seem to be a little bit unnecessarily gleeful, saying, hey, in the sense that they feel like they were hurt by this movement, so they took a little bit of glee in seeing the zeitgeist figure of it going down, as having his marriage fail, which is unfortunate. But that's almost kind of neither here nor there. The point I'm making here is, this is a hasty generalization if you're saying, hey, Harris wrote this book saying, if you do this, you're going to have a good marriage. Now his marriage is falling apart. Therefore, there's something wrong with the book he espoused. That's a hasty generalization. Now, I do think there are things wrong with the book he espoused, but you can't get there from just he and his wife are separating. There could be a whole host of other reasons why he and his wife are separating that are completely unrelated. And just to reiterate, this is a case where it's hard to see that because your mind is immediately going to want to try and draw correlations between he wrote this book about marriage and his marriage is having problems, they're separating. But it's still a case of hasty generalization, even though it's harder to see. Even the other example I gave about a friend who has a business where he has no idea what he's doing. So we all should be on the lookout for hasty generalization. It happens a lot. Generalization itself is not necessarily a bad thing, only when it's hasty. You've got to think it through and go, well, could there be other explanations than the one I'm espousing here? And if they're there, what would they look like? How would I go about searching for them? And things along those lines. And in this case, because it's the private lives of two other people who most of us, who I don't know personally, and I'm assuming the people who wrote these articles don't know personally, there probably really isn't any way, but at least no appropriate way, where we could go figure out, is this the reason why? But in many other cases of hasty generalization, you certainly can go explore them more. Like in the example I gave of the guy who doesn't know anything about business, you can go look and see, well,
Did the government pass regulations that drove businesses like his out of business? Was there a fire? Were there other mitigating factors like that? And then if there's not, you can then turn around and say, yeah, it probably failed because this guy knew nothing about economics and nothing about how to run a business. So anyhow, that's this week's episode. As always, write and let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the simple foreknowledge view. I find it kind of interesting. Let me know what you think about Philip's analogy to time travel to try to say that the future and the past are similar. I'm not quite sure I'm ready to go with him there, but I'm going to think about it some more. So you can reach me for comment of any kind at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and you can always leave a comment on the Facebook group I started, The Examined Life with Phil. As always, thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing here with the podcast, share it with your friends, share it on social media, rate or like the podcast on any of the podcast sites like iTunes or iHeartRadio, and I'll have another episode up for you next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.